Hmm? Fine. So we have seen. Fine. Earlier we have seen about the Java EE specifications. One of the specification is the servlet specification. Okay. Fine. We can have servlet specification, implementation of the servlet specification independently. Fine. Instead of having an implementation of the entire Java EE specifications. Fine. And one such example is Tomcat. Okay. Fine. This is an example where we have only implementation of servlet specification. Fine. So now onwards we are mainly going to be looking at the servlet specification, which is about web interfacing. Fine. It's more related to a web interface. Okay. So let's see what exactly is what exactly is this web application about. Fine. Here they have used concepts of web application. Okay, and let's see this. Okay, how do we make a interaction in web? Mainly using a URL. Fine. Example would be fine. With this we had even seen with when we saw the API for the client side of HTTP protocol. We have now moved to the server side. Okay, so let's see this. A typical URL would look like http:// and then you specify some host : port number / some path / something. Fine, you can have a full path. A hierarchical path can be specified. Fine. So when we give this as input to the browser, what does it do? Fine. Uses the host and port to make a connection to a server. Fine. Makes connection to a server. So on that host, so this is the host, on that specific port number there is a server which is listening. Fine. So fine, he is going to interact with this, right? And yes, what is the interaction? We saw that yes, it will send a request called get. Fine, it's going to say get, and this part is what is sent across. Fine. Okay, so now when the server receives this request, what is the duty of the server?
Server is listening the request and respond.
It's only responsible for giving back a proper HTTP response. Fine. Okay. Fine. Your URL, when we look at a URL, it might the path which it gives. Normally, we find it to be something like / something / maybe something .html, or no, it looks like a file name. Something which looks like a file name. It may look like a file name, right? But it need not be a physical file here. And it need not be a physical file here. It's just that yes, this string is one input given to the server, and that triggers something. Okay, that can trigger some processing here, which would in turn result in a response. Fine. The only thing is I will be giving response. Maybe you can have a server, whatever input you give, I always give the same response. There's no file. You can give me any file. It's still valid. Clear? So one thing, it need not necessarily be, though it looks like a file, it's something. Yes, it's one input to the server, and then for this input, it's a resource name. Just think this is a resource name, and I should be, this resource name should be generating a response for me. Clear? Okay, it's just that part, right? So now we are interested in knowing various kinds of what are the knowing what can be done on the server side. Okay, servlet specification is actually about the components which you can have here on the server side. Okay, fine. Now in the most simplest terms, right, what we have here is, if you look at that URL, fine, in the URL this part, right, after the host and port you have slash, you have something, slash, so many things, right. What has been done here is, we have in the servlet specification, the concept of a web application has been introduced. Okay, so there is a concept of a web application which has been introduced since servlet specifications 2.0 onwards. Fine, earlier every resource was independent thing, fine, and there was no standardization. Okay, even within servlet there was no standardization about how the implementations related to the implementation of the specification. Okay, now what we have is a concept of a web application. It's been since very long time, it's not now. Okay, yeah. So web application, concept of a web application is that yes, you may like to have you have a set of URLs. It's nothing but a group of URLs, group of resources created for a specific application. For example, someone says, oh, I want to develop an application for an inventory. Fine, if you want to have an application for an inventory, fine, you would have some URLs, okay, host and port, and then slash, maybe you have inventory, slash, and then there are all number of possibilities. So it's a group of URLs. Okay, slash inventory here is nothing but representing a web application. And the first level in the hierarchy represents an application. Okay, fine, that's what is representing a web application, and within this, yes, you will have several options. Fine, whatever you give, okay, oh, this request is for inventory application, that's what the server will understand. Fine, and within this, yes, you can have anything. Okay, so first level, this represents, so this is my web application.
So once I develop the web application, I have to declare certain URLs which is available for the client.
Yeah, but they would have the starting is a web application, right? The start of the URL starts with the application and slash, then it could be anything. So it would be understood that okay, this is meant for so and so web application. Fine, on a web container, fine, I use the term web container for something like Tomcat. Okay, so on a web container we deploy several web applications. That's deployment of a web application. The concept of deploying a web application is there. For every web application, okay, for any web application rather, you have a standard directory structure. There is a standard directory structure. Okay, so we have a directory structure, okay, of web application. Yeah, what's the structure of the web application? Okay, so for if you want to create any web application, what you need is one folder, one directory. Okay, the directory structure, fine. For example, if someone says, oh, I want to have a application called inventory, fine, then he would need to have a folder called inventory. He needs to have a folder called inventory, and in this folder, very simple thing is, yes, in this folder he organizes all his resources as simple files. Okay, one thing is, yes, you just need to have one folder which matches the name of the application, and in that folder just organize all your resources, which are simple files, HTML files, images, all kinds of static content which we talk about. Fine. So all your static content can be here. Okay, but then a web application, we are talking about a Java platform, is not going to be only about static content. Fine. You would like to have, fine, the response which I want to give, a particular resource should be such that yes, if someone comes and asks for that resource, it should be actually invoking a Java component, okay, which can connect to the database, fetch some information, and then decide what the response should be. Fine. We may like to have response being generated by some Java component. Okay. Fine. Response is mainly a content. What we are interested in, what is the content being sent. Okay. So the content should be generated by a component. See, these are all contents. I'll put them, these are files. When we say static, they are themselves content. You ask for that content. Fine. Okay. But then we could be having some other Java component. Fine, we could be having Java component. So now,
Java component like
now see one more type of a Java component is the applet.
yes.
Now what is this applet as a component? Applet, yes, if your application has a applet, fine, it would be just like all other static content, because this is the content which would be sent to the client. This is the content. Applet is what? Yes, it's a Java component, but it's not for server side. It is to be used on the client. So it for a web application which is on the server side, a applet which is still a Java component, but it would still be just treated like any other content. Fine. You have PDFs, you can keep PDFs, you can keep any kind of content. Okay. But then you would like to have some space where you can have the Java components which are working on your server side. Fine. They are not meant as content to be transferred. Fine. They are not to be transferred as response straight away. Fine. They are not responses.
They work on server side.
They work on server side, and for that reason what we need is some space, because everything is available as URL. So we need some space in our application. So what has been done is we have a private folder. So there is a special name web-inf. Okay. If we have a folder by this name, this is a private folder for the application.
This we talk in reference to Java web specification, that is Tomcat.
Tomcat. Not only Tomcat, servlet specifications.
Servlet specification.
Any web application,
Even in
Java
JavaScript
based.
also that will be
Yes, it's the same.
Okay.
We are not talking about any specific container at this moment.
So web
Fine.
INF will be the
This is the structure of a web application as given in the specification.
Java. So
Servlet specification. Yeah. Huh.
web INF folder will remain in all the web
Yes, yes.
applications.
So
If it
you
is-
only need to be creating a folder like this. Fine. It's where you keep the folder that would change. How to deploy this folder? Your web application you need to create. But then this application needs to be deployed in a server. How to deploy will depend on the kind of server you are using. But this is a standard. That's a standardization 2.0. Servlet specifications 2.0 did the standardization. Okay, earlier there was no standardization. Okay, we have servlets, we can have components which are a Java component which can work on the server side and can give a response. There was no concept of a application also. That was long back anyway. But then this is a standardization which has been done. So full directory structure, fine, fixed directory structure with something like web.inf. And again, okay, web.inf is a private space, that's what I've mentioned. But within web.inf, okay, the Java components have to be organized in something called, we have a folder called classes. Okay, it's in this folder that we have all our class files. Any class file which is needed would be here. They're not only servlets,
All class.
all class files which you need here. Fine. The servlet in turn are using other classes.
So our all class,
They would all be in the classes folder.
so our all class file we have to put in the
Classes
web.inf,
folder.
web.inf
Under web.inf classes.
classes. Yes.
Okay, fine. So you have so many classes. Maybe you are using some drivers. You are using some third-party APIs.
Yes.
Fine. You got your library from somewhere else. Fine. You are using some different kinds of libraries, and you would like to use here. Okay. For then they are available in the form of a jar file. If you got any jar file, any other things, keep them in a folder called under web.inf. So this is the place for jar files. This is a place for class files. The Java components, fine, the .class files, or fine, they would be organized. The Java components have to be organized, which are server side components. They have to be organized here under web.inf. Fine, classes folder, lib folder. And jar files in lib, class files and classes. Fine. Now you have so many classes, okay, but some of these are servlets. Some of those classes are
implementing servlet.
actually servlets. They are the components which act as a resource. Fine. They are the components which should be acting as triggered by a resource name. Okay, so what we have here is we need a particular file which we call as a deployment descriptor. We have a deployment descriptor, okay, for every web application called, sorry, it's the web.xml. Fine, we have the file called web.xml. Okay, this is known as the deployment descriptor for our web application. It's an XML, simple XML file. Okay, and this is nothing but having information about your application. Fine, what is this web application? Fine,
So jar file is in lib.
any jar file should be in lib folder of web.inf. And the class file should be in the,
class.
all class files should be in the classes folder. Okay. Now coming to this web XML, which is the deployment descriptor. Okay, so it's like every web application. Fine, every web application normally would have a web.inf folder containing a web.xml. Okay, fine. For every web application, now just think in terms of this. This is one folder which I have created, and I am deploying it in my web container. Fine, could be Tomcat, could be anything. Fine. So, okay, I'll now talk about Tomcat. In Tomcat, okay, if you have installed Tomcat, Tomcat has in its home folder, it has one folder called web apps. Okay, it's a folder in Tomcat, in case of Tomcat. And within this is the place where you keep all your web applications. So folder, for example, that inventory if you wanted to have, you would have a folder called inventory over here. That same directory structure which we talked about, but that inventory was one, so web application is one structure, it's one directory. Keep it under web apps in case you want it for Tomcat. Okay, so that's a very simple thing. Fine. Now let's see when we start Tomcat what exactly is happening. Okay, let's relate to what happens when we start a web container like Tomcat. Fine, I'm just being specific about Tomcat, but could be any other. Fine. Whenever we start our web container, what the web container would do, it would look for what are the web applications which have been deployed. Okay, it would look for what are all the web applications which are deployed here. And now let's look at what's happening exactly in the JVM. It's a Java based, these are all Java based things, right? So if I look at this as a container, right, this is my web container. Okay, in this container corresponding to every web application which has been deployed, the container would first create an object of, okay, so it's creating an object of something called servlet context. We have an object of servlet context. A servlet context represents a web application. An object of servlet context represents a web application.
So those many applications will be there.
As many as the number of applications deployed, so many objects would get created. Servlet context. Okay, there is an inventory application which is there. Okay, I need to create one object.
For inventory.
Yes.
So for the every web application, there is a separate
Object of servlet context. Fine. Okay. So what is there? What is the information available? What is this? It's about one application. Okay, one application, one servlet context. So every application has certain attributes. And for every application, there will be certain information. Okay, fine. For example, there is option. Now I'm also talking about web.xml. Fine. There is one web.xml for this.
Yes.
Okay. So what goes in the web.xml? Okay, web.xml is something which you have created to give some information related to the application. It's a description for the application by the developer. And it may have certain things which are specific to the place where you are deploying the application. You deploy at a different place, maybe you change some of the things in the descriptor. And you may be changing some of the things in the descriptor. Let's see this. Fine. For example, now I am giving the structure of web.xml and will relate to this also. Okay. So we have the web.xml file having tags like, so first tag is web app. There is a tag called web app. So everything, top level tag is web app, everything between web app and /web app. Okay, within web app, some of the things which are there, okay, you can always use description tag, inner tag description is there, but another tag is tag called display name. So I have display name and /display name. Okay, within this display name, you can keep some name. Now the use here is, yes, when you have any container, all containers would provide an administrative tool. Okay, so in the administrative tool, you should be able to see a list of web applications. Fine, as an administrator, you will be seeing the list of web applications. So there, how do you identify them?
That name will be.
So that name is there. So this is the display name which is picked up there. Okay. Anyway, that thing is also available in servlet context. In the object, the servlet context object has actually read the
Complete
web XML file. It is reading the web XML file. Okay, fine. So in this servlet context, which is there as an interface, it's there as an interface. Okay. The display name is something which you have written in your web.xml file as a application developer. So I decide to call it as maybe in the display name I'll say, okay, Zensoftech inventory. Fine, this is Zensoftech inventory, right? So when someone sees, administrator sees the list of all applications, yes, it will be visible as Zensoftech inventory. So just to identify. So this is the information which comes from web.xml. Okay, fine. So servlet context has a method called get servlet context name to return a string. Right? It has method like this. A method to return string, get servlet context name without parameters, and that can return a string. Get servlet context name is a method available in servlet context. See, Tomcat is reading web XML and creating this object. Anything which is in web XML is available through servlet context. Servlet context is my application.
It reflects only the data of web XML and it is converted
Yeah,
into a
plus more.
which resides in
Plus more, because this is the object through which the components which the application developer has created are going to be able to interact with the server. Fine. For example, servlet context also has a method called get server. It would give, okay, this is Tomcat or whatever it is, because that's a point of interaction for components with the container. See, application developer, you are creating your servlet maybe or any other component. All such components would get the object of servlet context. Through this, they are able to interact with the container.
Sir, servlet context is the object, right?
Is the object created by
system itself.
container.
Container, yes. All objects are created by
Hmm.
container.
So for one app, there is one servlet context.
For one web application, one servlet context
But
object.
within the one app,
There are so many other components.
Number of servlets.
So yes,
So
let's
for
see
that
how.
servlet also there will be a servlet context.
No, there's one
Only one.
one per application.
One per application.
That's all.
Okay.
Fine. So when the container starts, it looks at the deployed web applications. How many web applications have been deployed? For every deployed web application, create object of servlet context.
So this servlet context will have all the information, web XML, servlets, whatever is
Let's see.
listed.
Let's see the web XML further. Okay. So one was this
Display name.
display name. Now another thing is maybe you have certain parameters for this web application which may be different at different places. Fine. In an inventory application, you may have created some things like, okay, in this the costing should be done based on LIFO, or someone says no, it should be based on FIFO. So if you have parameterized that, fine, your application understands that, maybe you might like to mention that here. So we have, yes, so the web.xml can be used for having certain settable parameters which are at the application level. Okay, someone may say, okay, the logo which should be used here is, this is the place where I have got the logo. or maybe the company name. Someone says, okay, let me put it here. You can have the web.xml, it's a deployment descriptor. When you deploy at a particular place, you may make changes accordingly, fine. Okay, so you can give such parameters by putting a tag called context-param. So we have this tag called context-param. Fine. For example, another place where we use context-param very commonly is in order to make a connection to a database. Fine. We have certain parameters like, okay, what is the URL to make a connection? What is the driver name? What is the JDBC driver which you are using? So those information which can be used for making a database connection, that may also be kept as context param. Fine.
So it is also mentioned.
It can be, yes. So the idea is you can have parameters for the application level. Yes.
If we want any external permissions like any services, so we also
which can be changed.
Okay.
Fine. Anything which can be changed. Fine. So, I am deploying for a different place. Okay, I'll make this change.
So we've got XML is same as in Android web manifest file.
And the way to do it is context param, param name. Okay, give some parameter name and give a param value tag. Okay, some value. Okay, and slash context param.
So there we can set n number of parameters.
So like this, any number of context param entries can be there. This is for one parameter. So you can create any number of such parameter entries.
So sir, हमें किसी इमेज को रखना है तो भी यहाँ देना पड़ेगा उसके लिए?
नहीं, not necessary. You want to be able to specify a different path when it's in a different place, then okay. Fine, so we have what we call context param entry. Okay, now let's talk about the servlet. Coming to the servlet. Yeah.
Elaborate about the types of parameters can be set into context parameters, logo, company name. Display name is a company name.
Display name could be, display name is for the administrator.
But context parameter में और क्या-क्या set हो सकता है?
Connection related.
Okay.
Yeah. Because at a different place.
Connection.
Yeah. Because that connection URL would include the database server's IP address also. Fine, which is going to be different. Maybe the login for the credentials into the for connecting to a database will be different. So that information can be here. Huh? Yeah. Huh? So if my application can understand LIFO and FIFO and wants this information to be changeable. Okay, I deployed one place as LIFO, another place as FIFO. Of course, my components should be ready to understand them and be able to act accordingly. Fine. So it's like any, we are saying this is application level parameters.
So entire application can be configured in web.xml.
But then your component should be able to understand. It will be the duty. It will be the duty of the
developer
container to make this information available to you. And how it will be available?
through servlet.
Through the servlet context. Okay, so when you make these entries called context param, right? If you have any entry called context param, we will have methods. We have methods in the servlet context, okay, called. So this is method in servlet context. Get init parameter names. What are all the different kinds of parameter names which have been used here? And I can get an enumeration of string. So all the parameter names I can get init parameter, takes as parameter a string, you give a parameter name and get the corresponding value. So these methods are available so that you can look at, fine, to make available what is in the deployment descriptor. Fine, so any number of context param, and this information available through servlet context. Fine, servlet context becomes important, right? Okay.
But sir, parameter like for example.
Example was connection related, database connection.
Okay.
How to make database connection. That's what is most common usage. Fine. Okay, then we have entry for servlet. So we are saying servlet. I would like you to create one servlet object. Fine. By making an entry in web.xml, we are actually instructing the container that you create one component of a servlet where and give a name to that component. So I am saying we have something called servlet-name. Give a name to that servlet. Fine, give some name to the servlet and we have a entry called servlet-class. Okay. Now this is by using servlet-class, we are saying, okay, create one object of this class. We are just saying create the object of this class, remember it by this name, associating a class. So asking it to create one object and remember it by this particular name. This is one object to be created and it has to be given. I am giving this name for it. I will refer to it by this name. Okay, servlet name, servlet class.
So sir, servlet class created here or in the class file?
You have developed a servlet class. This is a deployment descriptor.
Okay.
Which you have developed there, you will write.
You are only mentioning it. That I would like, you may have developed so many servlet classes.
So,
But in this application, I want to create one object of this class. Maybe you don't create the one of another class. When I am deploying at a different place, I don't want a particular servlet to be. So you are only saying when you start up this application, create object of this class.
So we just mention here.
We are not writing main.
No, we are not.
We are asking the container to do the things for us. Fine, we are saying create one object. And again, like we have parameters which are for the application level, you can have parameters for the servlet level also. So specific to this servlet, you may have certain parameters which are specific to the servlet. So in this particular servlet, I would like to have some parameters. So I have something called init-param, having inner tag called param-name and param-value. Okay, slash init-param. Okay, fine, we'll see certain, fine. So you are having any number of init-param entries, but they are inside the servlet entry. So I say, okay, this is the servlet and this servlet has, so these are the initialization parameters for my servlet. I would like you to create one object. Okay, give a name to it. Fine. Servlets may or may not be created right at the beginning. It can be that yes, only when someone is asking for a URL which relates to this servlet for the first time, then I'll load and create the object. And maybe if it is not being used for a long time, it may get unloaded and I may have to load it again. Now, what we have is an option which says, I would like you to load it right as soon as you start the application. This servlet needs to be loaded right at the beginning itself. So you have an option called load on startup, and there is a /load on startup between which you will be writing some numeric value 1, 2, 3, 4 like this. You may have several servlet entries, fine, and each one says there is a load on startup. Then in what sequence should I load them? That can be specified. So you are saying 1, 2, 3, 4 like that. Okay, so sequence number for startup.
It will
Startup, yeah.
The two servlets can have one number.
No, should not.
It should be in a sequential manner.
It has to be.
If I do a mistake,
It would depend on how the container reacts to it.
it should be sequential, not like
It is supposed to be
sequence.
the sequence number in which the creation and initialization of that servlet would be done.
I thought it is like MX priority 10, 10, 50,
No, no,
100 as
no. It's a sequence number.
if I have 100 servlets, then I have to number them
1 to 100.
1 to 100.
Yeah. Fine. And then you might have a /servlet. Now what exactly happens in the container? Because first thing was servlet context object 1 per application. Now you have several servlet entries. Fine, you can have multiple servlet entries. Okay, this you can have any number of them. Right. See another point here, small point which is related to, you have a servlet class and you have a servlet name. You can't have two servlet entries where the servlet name is same. You can't give the same name. You may have two servlet entries having the same class. I want the object of servlet of this class. One object, I want you to also create one more object of the same class,
But with a different servlet,
but with a different name,
so it will work as a different entity.
different servlet, different resource.
Yes.
This one is for a resource.
So supposingly I have a class which have multiple parameters, but for Russians I am developing a different servlet. For Indians I am developing a different.
Same servlet class. You have developed only one class.
But for different community I can.
I'll give a very simple example. I have a hello servlet. Okay, hello servlet. When someone says, invokes it, how should the greeting be done? Hello world. Or what is the greeting? Hi. What's the greeting? Namaste.
That is what, as per the local, I can have multiple servlets
Yeah.
of a simple class, same
So
class.
I create different servlet name. Okay, and then can have this as a so multiple object of the same class can be created, but the name has to be unique. In one web XML, I cannot be having two servlet entries with the same name. Okay, now this is what we are saying. Okay, this is what it is supposed to do. Now let's see what exactly happens when the web container, it comes across the servlet entry. It has come across web XML, it has created servlet context. Now it is coming across servlet entry. For every servlet entry which it is finding, it is looking at this information. all this information is read and it creates one object. For every servlet entry, a separate object would be created. So let's say we have 3 servlet entries. Okay, then there will be 3 objects. Okay, 3 objects of the type called
servlet-class.
not so servlet config. Okay, we have something called servlet config.
This is developed by the container.
This is generated by container. And this servlet config, when it is created, would have a reference to the context. They all know the same context. Okay, this object would be created. Okay, that's the first thing that it should be doing. Okay, and let me now also talk of a few things about the methods of servlet config. And this object which is getting created, right? So servlet config methods. We have the servlet config has method called one method to return servlet context. Method name is get servlet context. When get servlet context is a method of servlet config, right? The servlet config is created within an application. For every servlet entry, one servlet config. Other methods of servlet config, get servlet name returns a string. Yeah, you have a servlet name in servlet/servlet. You have kept a servlet name. That name. We have a method called the 2 methods which we had here. These 2 methods. Get init parameter names and get init parameter. There are initialization parameter at servlet level. So these are the 4 methods. There are 4 methods in servlet config, nothing more than this. It has read your web.xml and created the servlet config object. And now it is looking at this. Oh, this is the servlet class whose object needs to be created. Okay, so it now creates an object. So it says, okay, let's create the object of the servlet which you wanted. You wanted 3 servlets, I have got 3 objects. It now creates an object of servlet, and first thing it has to do is make available all this information by using the first lifecycle method of servlet. Okay, so we have one interface. Oh, all this which I am talking about, the servlet config, the servlet context, they are part of which package? They are all in javax.servlet package. We have this package javax.servlet. Fine. This is not part of standard JDK. It is part of Java E, or separately just the Java servlet itself, servlet specification. Fine. So in the javax.servlet package, you have the servlet context, you have the servlet config, you even have the interface called. So these are interfaces. We also have an interface called servlet. Okay. Fine. We have the interface called servlet. And in servlet interface, what's the first method? Returns void. Name of the method is init parameter the servlet config object. This is the first lifecycle method for a servlet. So create the object and inject the servlet config into the servlet. Fine. So the developer, fine, when as a developer, if I have to develop a servlet, what I'll do? In my servlet, I'll keep one instance variable for the servlet config. Okay, I'll have this method to just save the object.
So I have to explicitly mention servlet config as a variable.
As a private instance variable.
Okay. If
Fine.
I forget to do this, then it will be an error.
It's not an error. You're not interested in interaction with the container.
So this will not show any error, but it will be a big error.
See, the idea is it is enabler. It is enabling you to interact with the container. If you don't have this, if you don't keep this,
If I don't attend the school, it will not show any error, but it will be a big error. Interest.
clear?
Interest, yes.
That's the first lifecycle method. And anyway, you also have to implement one more method where I don't know what you'll do if you don't do that, because this is lifecycle method. I'm not now talking about a lifecycle method, but still, because it's an interface, servlet is an interface, it has another method where the return type is servlet config. It says get servlet config. I have given you something, you should be able to give it back also whenever needed. So there is this method called get servlet config which you will be implementing. And so if you have to implement this servlet interface, fine, there are 5 methods in the servlet interface. Fine. First one is the init. This is a lifecycle method. Second one is this. So now coming back to what's happening in the container.
There are a there is a servlet construct,
Fine.
servlet config, and then the servlet itself.
Servlet itself. So creation of this has taken place, and that is the initialization for us. But there are more things in web.xml. Oh, we have okay. Let's look at web.xml further. Fine. In the web.xml, we had display name, web app / web app. We have a display name, context-param entries, and then we have the servlet entries. So that is about creating the object. But then how do we use the object? So for that, we further have in the web.xml, you now do a mapping. You have something called servlet-mapping. You map a URL with the component. You have identified, given names to the component. So we have servlet mapping, which is this servlet name. Okay. Whenever you have the particular URL pattern. So you can give some URL pattern here and create a servlet mapping. Okay. Now about the URL pattern. Okay. You create such entries. Here you cannot have 2 servlet entries, 2 servlet mapping with the same URL pattern. But you may have more than one servlet mapping, maybe it uses the same servlet name. That means I want the same component, whether this is the URL or it may be the other URL. Multiple URL may still map to the same component. But I can't be giving 2 components for the same URL pattern.
Sir, servlet name must be independent.
Is identifying a component.
Okay.
It's my component.
Component. Servlet name is a component.
Hmm.
So
I'm saying create so many components.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I said, okay, this component when you have this URL, this component when you have this URL, that's a mapping.
I have a single servlet name which will have 10 different URL patterns.
That's okay.
It will fetch the same component.
It will use the same component.
For the servlet, different servlet names, I cannot have same URL pattern because there will be a
Different servlet names.
for
Yeah.
the same URL.
Your URL pattern cannot be repeating.
Yes. Otherwise, it has to decide same URL pattern. It will read and then which two that
No.
will confuse.
No. That should be unique. So URL pattern can't be. Okay. So your URL pattern, what goes in the URL pattern? Okay. So your URL pattern may look like, fine. So there are three ways of giving a URL pattern. Okay. One is in the URL pattern, you start with a slash. Okay. Then within the URL pattern, you start with a slash and give any kind of a hierarchical path, fixed path, fixed. But you should be starting with a slash. Now this slash, for example, let's say I'll say slash hello. Suppose I put slash hello. And my application was inventory. My application was inventory. That means this particular component, it maps to a name and for which we have a component created. This name cannot be a new one, okay? It has to be within the servlet. It has to be one of the servlets. Okay. Fine. So if someone says slash hello, it would mean this is something which is available by using the URL as http://host:/port/ application name is inventory /hello. And this slash hello is the slash hello in the URL pattern. So you have URL pattern which starts with a slash. This is within the application. Fine. Slash inventory identifies the application. Within that, this is my URL pattern. Clear? The slash of the URL pattern. Fine. The slash in the URL pattern. Okay. So you have URL pattern, which one way is fixed. Another is you can be using a wildcard. Wildcard can be, yes, you start with a slash, give some path, slash, fine, whatever, but it ends in a slash star. You can end in a slash star. You may give right at the beginning, it says slash star. Slash star would mean everything. If you just say slash star, oh, slash invoice slash star. So within invoice, I might have so many things handled by the same servlet component, one component for anything, but the start of the path is like this. The path starts like this. Okay, so ends in a slash star. Wildcard. Another is extension. Okay, in case of extension, fine, you do not use a slash at the beginning. You start with a star dot any extension name. Fine, someone says star dot hello. That's fine. So whenever we have a URL in which the extension of .hello comes, this is the component to be used. You can decide any URL, any extension name. Someone may, for example, someone may say, okay, let me keep it as star.asp. Yeah, and then you can have, okay, you can give an impression that this works on ASP. Three forms of URL pattern. The URL pattern may be given in one of these three ways.
First slash hello,
Slash and a fixed name, slash something. You can have a hierarchy, okay, that's fine. But you have fixed. There's no wildcard being used. Another one slash star, ending in a slash star,
And third one star dot.
star dot extension. Fine. So, what exactly happens? The container starts, looks at the deployed web applications, creates servlet context for each of them, looks at the servlet entries, fine, initializes them, create the servlet config, create the servlet object, initialize them, and then
Mapping.
mapping is known. Mapping is something to, that's okay, it has managed that, I know this mapping.
Wait for the
Then wait, that's the correct thing. Then start waiting. Waiting for what?
आता है तो करता हूँ.
Waiting for what?
HTTP request.
Waiting for a HTTP request.
तैयार होके बैठना, अब कोई बोलेगा तो
I am now ready. This is the startup part. Startup हो गया उसका. Startup is about
Get started.
creating and initializing.
App started.
Initializing the components. Init call हो गया.
न्यू वाला जो मेथड है वो क्रिएट हो गया सब JVM में आ गया.
अभी देखें इंटरेस्टिंग. करें.
So sir,
असली
ये जो
काम.
URL पैटर्न है ना
हम्म.
सर्वलेट में, तो उसका जो पैटर्न है उसमें फॉर एग्जांपल ऐसा होता है ना @/account क्लास फाइल रखने की होती है ना, जो भी
URL पैटर्न
Class-
और भी वस्तु है.
अपनों ने डिसाइड किया मेरे को ये URL से चलना चाहिए तो ये URL से चलना.
जे लिखा हुआ है लिखा हुआ है. तो हम लोग
ASP
એટલે આપણે બ્રાઉઝરમાં જે લખવું હોય એ લખવું.
हाँ.
URL कौन सा URL से अवेलेबल है?
ब्राउज़र में दैट प्लान जे माध्यम वाला वो है लखवा नहीं अगर दाम सर्वर डालो. ओके. એટલે તારી મનની પરિસ્થિતિ છે.
હા.
કે માઇકલ જેક્સન એવું લખે તો માઇકલ જેક્સન જેવું.
But before that will be the application name.
Yes.
एप्लीकेशन नेम जो है
स्लैश एप्लीकेशन के अंदर ये है मेरा नाम, ये पाथ से आता है.
प्लान बना उल्लू बनाओ गમે તે લખ્યું તો ચાલશે.
बोला था ना ASP लिख सकता है.
हाँ, मुझे लगा हमारा क्लास का नाम.
नहीं क्लास का नाम कुछ लेना देना है ही नहीं.
क्लास तो છે ને क्लास तो अंदर જ છે.
वो सर्वलेट में बोला था सर्वलेट क्लास, वहाँ क्लास का नाम खत्म हो गया. अच्छा, now one more point which is related to that servlet entry, small thing. Fine, छोटा सा एक काम है उसमें. We go back slightly. Okay, we have servlet name and then I said we have a servlet class. There is an option instead of giving servlet class, instead of saying servlet class, you can use another entry called, कहाँ पे डालूंगी, jsp-file and give slash करके the place where you have a JSP file. So either a servlet class or a JSP file. A JSP is a servlet, special kind of a servlet. The idea here is I don't write Java. I write HTML. I'm interested in text. I am developing a JSP file. And I'm making an entry here. That's my JSP file, but it's still a servlet name. You can still have a servlet name.
क्लास
Servlet name, not servlet class.
सर्वलेट.
I have not developed a Java file. I have not developed a class. I have developed a JSP.
So sir, JSP फाइल क्लास फाइल के ऑप्शन में.
Instead of saying servlet class, you can say JSP file.
So सर दोनों में डिफरेंस क्या है? क्लास फाइल और JSP फाइल.
Class file के लिए Java में लिखते हैं.
ओके. और
JSP के लिए HTML में लिखते हैं.
जो प्रोग्रामिंग होता है वो सब सेम ही होता है, पर वो
नहीं, प्रोग्रामिंग
प्रोग्रामिंग
नहीं.
तुमने पेज डिजाइन किया तो क्या किया? HTML.
यस.
वो JSP है. तुमने इम्प्लीमेंटेशन सर्वलेट इंटरफेस का किया तो क्या किया? क्लास फाइल.
सर
क्या बनाया है, क्लास बनाया कि JSP बनाया है, बस उतना ही बोलना है.
किसमें
I want one component. See, you are giving a name to your component. Fine. And that component, how it has been developed. Has it been developed as a servlet class or has it been developed as a JSP file? That is the option we have.
So, sir, practical small example.
Normally, the JSP file, an entry for JSP file is not normally shown. But if you show it, you have the option of even having init parameter for a JSP file. Normally तो ठीक है, JSP पे डिजाइन क्या रख दिया, it will be accessible. But we want some configuration information.
करेगा यहाँ का HTML ब्राउजर पे डिस्प्ले करेगा.
URL मैपिंग कर दिए तो करेगा. .jsp से नहीं, जो URL में डाला उससे JSP. It will be the JSP.
नहीं सर
Behind the scene is JSP, but you may use .asp.
सर वन डाउट, जैसे हम क्लास में पहले वेरिएबल डिफाइन करते थे, बाद में मेथड्स लिखते थे, तो जेएसपी में भी ऐसा ही करना होता है?
नहीं है, JSP में कहाँ क्लास और जावा ही नहीं है, वो JSP is not Java.
Is not there.
HTML आता है ना, हाँ बस तो वो JSP है.
ऐसा है?
हाँ,
ओके
JSP के अंदर तो HTML लिखते हैं, पूरा HTML/HTML लिख दे, नाम JSP लिखने का उसको, बस save as में .jsp आ गया ना, JSP था.
पर एचटीएमएल पूरा नहीं आता सर,
हाँ, ठीक है.
तो HTML पूरा किसी को नहीं आता.
केवल बना रहे हैं, बटन रखना बस इतना ही आता है।
HTML कोई ना पूरा नहीं आता.
Okay,
HTML बहुत वास्ट है.
okay, fine, let's continue.
यस
Okay.
Your choice. आज हमें नहीं मिला.
Fine. So now let's look at the picture again within the container. So what's happened within the container? थोड़ा सा बड़ा बनाना है. Okay. This is our container. Okay. We have one servlet context object. We have the servlet config object, which knows the context, and then we have our servlet object. Yes, there is, and each servlet object is given the servlet config object, so that way it is available. Here are the context param, display name, all that information is here. Here are the init param, servlet name, that's here. Each servlet has its own init param and servlet name. Fine, but they know the servlet context, and there is a servlet object for each of them.
Servlet context, servlet config, and servlet itself.
Now what happens is, yes, this has been created, initialized, that's how it is like this. Now what's done is, yes, we have a request
HTTP
coming
request coming
to the
servlet
container.
context container.
It is coming to the
Container.
container, Tomcat. It has come to Tomcat. What Tomcat does?
Tomcat will find the related
Application first,
application
and within the application it has to also identify
context.
the component which matches the pattern. Fine, it knows the pattern, but even before that, what it does, the first thing is, this has come in raw HTTP protocol over the network, right? And then whatever information it has got, it needs to convert it into a Java object. Okay, so what it is doing is, it's doing the job of first creating two objects. It creates two objects now. There are two objects being created. One is the object of servlet request, and what is the other object? The other object is nothing but it is allocating one blank buffer allocates a blank buffer and puts it inside an object of servlet response.
खाली
खोखा बना दिया और ये दो ऑब्जेक्ट बना दिए फिर आइडेंटिफाई किया गया. देन इट इज आइडेंटिफाइड विच इज द servlet component which should be used because of the URL pattern. Suppose it identified this is the servlet object. So in that case, it would invoke a method and make these two objects available to the servlet. What is the idea of giving these two objects? With the first object, you can know what the client has given to me. Find information about the information, whatever information comes from the client. That is the servlet request. And the other is a blank buffer which this servlet is supposed to fill. भर दो अंदर जब भेजना है. भेजने का काम मेरा है.
जो बफर है वो भेजेगा.
बफर है, ये दे दिया तुमको बफर. सर्वलेट ने जो अंदर भर दिया वो कौन भेजेगा? कंटेनर. काम कौन कर रहा है? कंटेनर.
प्रोसेसिंग करके जो देगा उसको कंटेनर आगे भेज.
तुम तो कुछ कर ही नहीं रहे हो.
क्योंकि उसको
हमारा काम तो बहुत छोटा है. सब काम तो देखो कितने कंपोनेंट्स बनाने का, क्या बनाने का, कब बनाने का, कैसे यूज करने का. It is so what is being happening is, yes, how is it giving these two objects? So for that the lifecycle method of servlet service. Service. So we have the method called service. This is the regular lifecycle method.
सबसे पहले context और फिर
Has two parameters. What are the two parameters? Servlet request and servlet response. ये दो ऑब्जेक्ट दे दिए इसको. It has throws. ठीक है अभी नहीं लिख रहा हूँ. But this is the regular life cycle method. Request अगर इस whichever
this method it is there only.
ये मेथड हमको इम्प्लीमेंटेशन लिखने का. We have to write the implementation. अब क्या करना है, एक रिक्वेस्ट में से तुमको क्या लेना है ले लो. तुमको ऑब्जेक्ट बना के दे दिया. HTTP प्रोटोकॉल की चिंता मत करो. मैं तुमको ऑब्जेक्ट जावा का ऑब्जेक्ट दे रहा हूं. दिस हैज द मेथड. सर्वलेट रिक्वेस्ट हैज अ मेथड. रिक्वेस्ट में क्या था?
रिक्वेस्ट में जो भी कंटेंट आए
पैरामीटर्स थे. क्वेश्चन मार्क वाला, क्वेरी स्ट्रिंग वाला, तो गेट पैरामीटर मेथड है उसमें.
parameters ले लो.
Now see this Java X.servlet package is very generic and not specific to the HTTP protocol. तुमको who is the client who has sent this is available from request. Get remote address. You can know the IP address of the client. अगर चाहिए तो.
तो तुरंत you have access this server through this IP. तुरंत वो लिख.
हाँ मिल सकता है. रिस्पॉन्स क्या है? उसके अंदर बफर है. बफर को कैसे लेंगे? गेट इनपुट स्ट्रीम नहीं, गेट इनपुट स्ट्रीम हमको तो बफर भर रहा है. गेट राइटर. गेट राइटर एक प्रिंट राइटर मिल जाएगा, उसमें डाल दो. जो भरोगे वो कंटेंट उसका, वो कंटेंट जाएगा. When we'll be looking at what is there in servlet request and what is there in servlet response, वो भी देखने का है, बाकी है. वो भी काफी कुछ है ना उसमें तो. फाइन. एंड देन इसके बाद क्या? टोटल 5 मेथड बोले ना. किसमें? सर्वलेट के. एक मेथड तो इनिट हो गया, दूसरा मेथड गेट सर्वलेट कॉन्फ़िग हो गया, तीसरा मेथड सर्विस हो गया. चौथा मेथड इनिट का अपोजिट होना चाहिए ना. से यू हैव योर वेब एप्लीकेशन का एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव टूल है, फिर बोला नहीं भाई ये थोड़ा एप्लीकेशन मेरे को एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन के लिए बंद करना है, अभी बंद करोगे तो ये सर्वलेट जो है इट विल हैव टू बी टेकन आउट ऑफ सर्विस. Even for some other reason, it may be taken out of service. बराबर. Fine. If a servlet is taken out of service, it will be invoking the method called destroy. No parameter. ये मेथड इन्वोक करेगा. तुमको ये लिखने का कि जब मैं आउट ऑफ सर्विस जाता हूं तो मेरे को क्या करना है, अगर कुछ करना है वो टाइम पे तो उसका चांस ये रहा. तो चार ही मेथड है, पांचवा क्या है? We have a method to return string. Name of the method is get servlet info. Information about servlet. इसमें क्या करने का हमको? Return a copyright message. अपना खुद का जो चाहिए वो रिटर्न करो बस, और कुछ नहीं. So 5 methods of servlet interface.
सर्वलेट आ गया.
कैसा है सर्वलेट? वेब XML का एक पार्ट देखा अभी. Fine, we have only seen some of the type of entries which go in a web XML. There are other kinds of components other than a servlet also. बराबर. सर्वलेट के अलावा और भी बहुत सारे components हैं which a web application developer can create.
तो बहुत लंबी फाइल होगी है.
हाँ,
बहुत
बहुत नहीं पर ठीक है.
इतनी बड़ी एप्लीकेशन, इतनी बड़ी
कितने कंपोनेंट है सब बोलना पड़ेगा ना उसको. कंटेनर चालू होता है वो देखता है, उसके हिसाब से करता है काम, एक्शन उसके ऊपर से होती है. ओके फाइन, ठीक है. सो विल कंटिन्यू टुमारो. बराबर है, कल है मंडे को नहीं, मंडे को छुट्टी. अच्छा
आ जाएंगे हम तो रिकॉर्डिंग करना.
हाँ
करके रिकॉर्डिंग करना. संडे को आएंगे तो भी हम आएंगे.